Hi, friends. Welcome to month 4 of Deeper. It's an absolute privilege to serve as your guide through this journey as we seek to open ourselves up to even more grace and grow more profoundly in our love for God and our love for neighbor as we begin to love ourselves in the same way that God loves us. One of the fundamental truths of spiritual formation is the necessity of learning to cut through the noise and the chatter of our own reactions to the world that's going on all around us. The ancients called this the process of knowing yourself. The idea is to know ourselves as we're fully known by the triune God who created everything that is, who loves us, who reconciled the world through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, who now gives us the Spirit. I've noticed in my own life, though, that there's a disconnect sometimes between the things that I say I believe are true about God, and I would even say the way that I react to the world around me. And through my own work, and I learned about this practice tool that we're going to explore this month through one of my own coaches who's a pastor, or was a former pastor. He's retired now in the former North Georgia Conference of the United Methodist Church. And this is what's known as saboteur work. So this month in Deeper, we're going to explore the inner critic. There's lots of books that have been coming out recently by Christian authors about this, but it's the idea, Paul talks about it in 2 Corinthians about taking every thought captive. And one of the first things we have to actually do to take thoughts captive is to actually recognize them. And in particular, there's an insidious type of thought. Zig Ziglar, if you ever listened to that old, one of the first, he was Christian, he was a motivational training speaker, Zig Ziglar. He always called this stinking thinking. And that's our tendency to judge. There's like an inner judge. And I think this is biological. It goes back to our amygdala. It's our fear response, that the flight, fight, fawn response, that when we have an external stimuli, our brain goes in overdrive to make judgments about it. It's kind of like when you put your hand on a hot stove, you instantly get burned and you pull your hand off. But the challenge with our thoughts is, even though we get the stimulus, we keep our hand on the stove. And we tend to judge. And we judge things out of that fear response. And sometimes it can also get mixed in with what I call the unholy trinity: fear, guilt, and shame as a response. And we have a tendency, and you can notice this is what we're going to work on this month. Pay attention to whenever you find yourself judging yourself, like negative tapes, like, man, that was dumb. Why did I do that? There I go again, judging others or judging circumstances. So we're just going to pay attention to that. And what the tool we're going to do, it comes from a website. You can go to, it's free. This is free. You have to give your email, but you can unsubscribe if you don't want the stuff after you get the assessment. It's positiveintelligence.com/saboteurs. And I'll put this in the email that you're getting that has this video. And this resource comes from this book, Positive Intelligence, by Shirzad Chamine. And this is a really helpful, this is a secular tool. He taught at Stanford, and he's an expert on leadership. And what we're going to find, though, and you may be surprised by this, is that this tool will dovetail really nicely with what we do in our rule of life and with our spiritual formation plan, because ultimately the goal of spiritual formation is what? To show up in a more loving space and to turn the volume down on fear and anything that causes us to just react, oftentimes inappropriately, over against just take the stimuli in and then respond with a loving presence. that's built out of love, that's derived from wisdom, that's the best part of ourselves. It's that sanctified part of ourselves. Because we all know, and if we went around and we could do this, though we won't when we get in our group, we can walk around and say, what are the contexts where I find it really difficult to show up as the Christian that I am, right? Who are the people that can push my buttons? What are the circumstances that trigger me? What are the thoughts that I have about myself that aren't indicative of the grace that I've received, right? That's what the Saboteur is. And what this test does is it basically takes your inner judge, and we all have that, our inner critic, and it just gives it what I would call, you can call it personalities or flavors. There's 8 saboteurs that are constellations, if you will, of what our inner judge is. In what we want to focus on is you want to look when you take the assessment and just see how high your scores are. If you have a couple that are over, say, 6, when you read the description, you're going to say, yeah, that really does sound like me. If you have really high ones, like when I first took this, I had a 9.4 on what's called hypervigilance. And so when I read that, it was like, yeah, that's exactly how I am. And I've always joked that I'm kind of like Marlin from Finding Nemo. I'm always worried that something's going to happen. When I'm driving down the road, if somebody swerves, I can see a traffic pile up. Somebody strikes a match in the woods. I can imagine a forest fire. That's hypervigilance. Again, having vigilance is good. That's like I touch something hot, but then I pull my hand off. But what these saboteurs are tracking is our extent to leave the hand on the hot stove. Okay. Now, the opposite of this is what we're going to work towards. Instead of coming out of things out of fear, is we want to pull back into the presence. We want to have a non-anxious presence. That's kind of a generic term now, so that we can make a non-anxious, wise, serene, loving response to whatever it is that ultimately stimulates us. That may just be simply turning the volume down on our own inner critic, or it may be actually responding appropriately to even a really serious situation. Because this isn't about just accepting whatever is. It's about getting the stimulus, refraining from a fear-based judgment that doesn't get us anywhere and will often make things worse, to being able to take loving action. Again, this doesn't mean that we're not going to have boundaries. This doesn't mean that we aren't going to engage in conflict, because you can engage conflict out of fear, or you can engage conflict in a loving way where we show up and hold space, right? And you can still engage in real disagreement. We can go beyond that, but the goal of this month is begin to start turning the volume down on our inner judge, so that our spiritual formation practices, which you've been doing before you even got into this, but we've been doing some intentional things, that the grace that God gives us through that will begin to manifest even more and more in our lives. Right, so take the assessment, and I'll be sending out some weekly reminders on what to do. But then once you take it, one of the first things you want to do is just notice. And this is the first thing, is just notice. Become aware during your day when you find yourself either criticizing or judging yourself, judging harshly somebody else, or judging a circumstance that you find yourself in. Just label it judge. Just notice. That's the first thing. So if we want to break out of that and turn the volume down and open ourselves up to loving response, we first have to notice the places and the times that we run into trouble. And I have a worksheet, and I'm going to ask you to read your saboteurs, and I want you then begin to look for contexts, people, situations where you begin to see the judges show up. And again, we'll add some things each week, and we'll have a great conversation at the end of the month. Continue with your shared practices. If the journaling's working for you, continue to do that. Continue with some silent practices if you're finding that helpful, and for sure continue to read the Psalm daily that's based on the lectionary. If you have any questions, reach out. Look forward to seeing you, and it's my absolute privilege to serve you in the Deeper program.